welcome you all to the call as I will proceed with some of the announcements as we kick off here and let folks join. This is just the very top of the hour. We're going to be covering mostly material hardship, which is a carryover as a new domain from the work we were doing with financial strain. And then also going to be kicking off some concepts of stress, which is really just kind of setting the guardrails for some of the work we're going to be doing over the next few months there. Welcome, everybody. Next slide, please. Thank you for joining us. We usually have a fair number of attendees, and so we always try to mute participants upon entry. We ask that you remain muted to avoid background noise during the call. The call is recorded always, and recordings are uploaded to the Gravity Confluence page following the call. So they're archived there, and should you wish to, there's nearly 2 years of meetings that you can review if you desire. So you are encouraged to actively participate in the discussion. I really try to work in all comments from the chat. So please send a chat to everyone, and I will do my best to bring it into the conversation. I do want to note that sometimes individuals send me private messages. I have a very hard time discerning public messages from private messages, so I might just read it out loud. So if there's something personal you wish to express to me or some comment and you do not wish it shared, then writing an email is a good way to do it. If you're okay with it possibly being shared, just put it in the chat and I'll do my best. Next slide, please. This is our common antitrust practices statement. Next slide. This is our call for participation. So we are always reviewing our processes as we've kind of become a living thing in a way that we didn't anticipate in the beginning. We encourage everyone to join the project. We're trying to figure out ways to assess ongoing engagement, just to differentiate a quorum for voting, but we do encourage you to officially join the project at the link. Again, you'll see that any of the links that we're talking about should be put in the chat for ease of use, so you can click on them and save them, or even just follow them while we're talking. If you want to check whether you've already signed up or if other members of your organization have signed up, you can review the existing membership at the next link. And then the last link is the Confluence. We do want to thank some of our members who've met with our team to revise some of the content of the Confluence to make it a little bit more able to be navigated. But if you want to review all of the information of the Gravity Project, that last link there to the Confluence as an entire set is a good way to go. Next slide, please. A nod gratefully to our project founders, grantors, and in-kind support. The Gravity Project is as a collective of many hands making labor light. So some of our colleagues offer funding support, some of our colleagues offer funding and expertise, some of our colleagues offer labor. I'm very, very grateful to everyone who helps make the Gravity Project go. Next slide, please. There's a lot of Sarah on the agenda. So bear with me, I'll do my best. We might end a little early today, which is kind of a nice denouement after we've been so busy finishing up the last domains from the previous sets. So I'm going to go through some announcements. I'll then discuss the project schedule and overview. We have some concepts to review about our orientation for material hardship. I'll kick off some general concepts regarding orienting to stress as a determinant, and then discuss community homework and next steps. Next slide, please. Announcements, next slide. We are seeking sponsors for the completion of our 2021 operations. If you're interested in learning more about sponsoring, you can send an email to thegravityproject@emiadvisors.net or visit the sponsorship page on the Confluence. Next slide, please. I always try to give a shout out to the sister meeting. So we do try to talk about everything in the public calls, but the public calls really principally focus on some of the terminology work that we do. At least it's kind of at least half of each call. We specifically focus on the Fire IG in the HL7 Fire IG public meetings for the SDOH work. That's Wednesday from 3 to 4 Eastern time. You can always find the HL7 meeting calendar at the link. So that meeting is led by my colleague Bob Dieterle. He had conflicting meetings today and so is not here to talk about tech. But again, you can always find him on Wednesdays from 3 to 4. Next slide, please. I'm happy to announce officially that the ICD-10 submission is scheduled for review at next week's ICD-10 Coordination and Maintenance Committee meeting. I know it was not on the agenda as published in the public register because that official agenda that was released about 3 months ago was not final. We are presenting. We have about a 10:20 time slot. Information about how to attend the meeting you can find at the ICD-10 Coordination and Maintenance Committee webpage. We really want to thank all of you that have contributed to the development and review of the submission. It's immense. Because there's so many submissions, our public comment and question period is actually quite slim. I have about 10 minutes to present, and they estimate only 1 or 2 questions. So we really are hoping the individuals make their case with written letters of support. So the next stage of the process, so if it's approved and moved from the committee, it'll go into public comment, but really moving it from the committee into public comment is a hurdle. So we have a form letter we've written. All of this information is on the Confluence. Please write your letters of support and email them to NCHS. And we're very, very grateful for your investment. One note, and I think it'll be updated shortly, there was one revision on the ICD-10 submission. At this time, given actually the similar concerns in SNOMED, we are not putting forward the severity strata of food insecurity right now because there's some sense that they're simply stating mild, moderate, and severe food insecurity might be misconstrued depending on the tool. So we're looking to other ways to convey severity by working with our subject matter experts that might be as simple as stating that you are severely food insecure because you're missing or skipping meals. Again, this is work we'll loop back around with, but the ICD-10 submission is ready to go, and we will present on it next week on Wednesday, and we hope to have you all there as participants.
Sarah, are you presenting, or are others in this group also presenting?
They only allow one presenter. So
that's you. Great.
That's me.
So the more letters that come from this group, the more substantive your second sentence is. We have X number of letters supporting Y number of propositions. And that's why we're here, because all these people want this.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
And it's unlike USCDI, it's been difficult for us to collate all of the letters that are sent to NCHS because people have been sending them directly and not always CCing us. We do know and are very, very grateful for the letters we've seen. And we do hope that the form letter, which based on recommendations has a first paragraph that's unique to you, so it doesn't get lumped in. We do hope that the form letter is helpful. And I want to give a special shout out actually to our colleagues at Salute America. We met them through an NQF quality measure development TEP. And we had a lovely encounter with them last week, and they're firing off an email blast among their network in support of the submission. So grateful for the collective at large. Any other questions on ICD-10-CM given its timeliness before we move on? All right. Okay. And
Sarah, this is Evelyn. I'm putting the link to Salute America in the chat.
Oh yeah, thank you. It's always good to find friends out there. Any other questions before we move on? All right. Okay, next slide, please. We are happy to state, as you likely anticipated, we reached consensus on our representative data sets for inadequate housing, transportation insecurity, financial strain, education, unemployment, and veteran status. Whew. That was some of the inadequate housing domain had carried on from the summer. So I really cannot underestimate the amount of effort that went into that. Very, very grateful for the collective. We're now in the phase where we kind of knit some of the comments together to ensure that any of the comments that were on the votes, yes, with comment, are rectified. We will get back to any person who voted that needed a comment rectified shortly. Right now, we really are focusing on trying to get that ICD-10 submission presentation set, but very, very grateful. Of course, all the final domain sets can be reviewed on the Confluence in their respective domains. Again, so we're right now reviewing all the comments, addressing some of the comments, and moving forward as best we can with submissions to the terminologies if we're able to do so. Any other questions on that? Just a simply Herculean effort, team. Thank you very much. Okay, next slide, please. Evelyn, do you want to speak to this one?
Sure, thanks. So that are not aware, ONC has published an announcement, notice of a funding opportunity under their Leading Edge Acceleration Projects, otherwise known LEAP, grant program, to support the testing of standards available for social determinants of health related social referrals. So we're excited that the grant incorporates the Gravity standards. And it's open to all. Of course, it looks, it's really around the ability to move forward or develop or present innovations that support standardized closed loop referrals. There's an information session next week. Please register for it. Applications are due May 10th. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. I'm going to go ahead and address a question that I see in the chat. So Suzanne, the question is, do data sets already exist for food insecurity, or is that in the future roadmap? That's actually in our past work. So Suzanne, that was our kickoff domain about, is it really 2 years? It's like 2 years ago. Yeah, so that is the domain that we started with. It's very exciting. If you're a nerd like myself, you can watch some of the intervention concepts bloom into the most recent release of NCT. So yes, we started with food insecurity. We then addressed housing instability and homelessness, and then moved into the domains that you see there: inadequate housing, financial strain, and transportation insecurity, and etc. So if you can find each of these domains in their master sets as they stand on the Confluence, as I mentioned, and we're looking in the future to start to offer other information once we start getting these concepts built into code, because we have our data sets represent what we think needs to be done, but there is a reconciliation process as we work with the terminologies. So soon on the Confluence, you'll find what's been built. So there's the thing we propose, and there's what actually we've negotiated and built, and that will be found on the website soon as well. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Lovely. As an implementer, what use cases will I be able to implement relative to the terminology work has been completed? So Corey, if you're mentioning our use cases specifically as the Gravity Project, and actually I love that you're asking this question, Corey. So specifically, if we think about the original use case for the Gravity Project, which is coming up, which is screening and assessing social determinants of health. So one of the things that's most robust so far is the screening questions and answers in LOIC, which are kind of the principal thing that we build across all of the core comprehensive screeners. So that information is part of our first use case. And then diagnoses concepts across SNOMED and impending ICD-10 CM are certainly part of that as well. When it comes to the second use case of sharing data with community partners, this is where the intervention concepts of those first core sets are really critical. If we think about, we have intervention concepts built with goals for food insecurity, housing instability and homelessness, inadequate housing, et cetera. So if we think about just what I was talking about with SNOMED CT, right? So given that these intervention concepts are already into the SNOMED ecosystem, and knowing that we have now all of the USDA tools built into LOINC, one can imagine screening a patient for food insecurity with a USDA validated tool, diagnosing food insecurity with an existing SNOMED CT term, and intervening on food insecurity in any aspect of the care team with the existing SNOMED CT language that is there right now. Was that was that a good answer, Corey? I think so, Corey. I hope that was a good answer. Please write in the chat if that did not answer your question. But certainly, food insecurity as the one that went first in the example I just gave is a way to certainly meet or try to meet at least use case 1 and use case 2. All right. Next slide, please. Oh, Evelyn, do you want to do this, or I should do this? This is the
Go ahead.
Okay, the ONC 2021 annual meeting is March 29th through 30th. And it's from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. EST. Our ONC is a critical Gravity partner, and we're grateful for all of their support, and you can register at the link. Next slide, please. So we've been announcing the Siren Coffee and Science podcasts. Siren is our anchor organization. They were part of the founding of the Gravity Project. We're very, very grateful for all of their support. So tomorrow is the podcast in which I have the honor of interviewing Michael Ballett. So we'll be talking about building accountability for social risk screening into state Medicaid programs. This is when I get to talk to people who are incredibly brilliant. And we'll be talking specifically about the history of social risk screening and likely how quality measures figure into that and how states are approaching this in novel ways at this time.
Sarah, what time is that tomorrow?
I'm pretty sure it's 12:20 EST.
Thank you.
And I'm not often nervous, but I am a little nervous. It's a podcast. It's a little nerve-wracking. So if all of my friends are there, that'll be great. Okay. Next slide, please. All right, project schedule and overview. Next slide. So this is the Gravity Roadmap. It's really lovely to move the dial a little bit, right? So we've wrapped up our inadequate housing, transportation insecurity, financial insecurity, and demographics work. Again, when we say wrap up, there's a whole lot of work that keeps on going. Linda and I can testify that now begins the work of actually working with the terminologies to try to build the gaps into code. But we're kicking off now and finishing stress and material hardship and those interpersonal domains of interpartner violence and elder abuse and social isolation. We're really very excited about the subject matter experts we're connecting with in this space. We are building an intentional break in July, and then focusing on some of the environmental domains and societal domains in the late summer and fall. I want to remind folks at this time, really because of some of the complexity of trying to, addressing kind of the ecosystem of interventions and resource directories and program taxonomies. For these next 4 domains, we're focusing specifically on screening, questions and answers, and diagnoses. This is not to say that don't submit goals and interventions, but it's really to focus on those screening, questions and answers and diagnoses at this time. All along this work happens the technical work, and you can see that we're doing some reconciliation of the implementation guide ballot. I think we still don't know the date of the upcoming Connectathon. I think that'll be posted about a month ahead. So we're looking, if it's in May, it'll be about in April. And we're recruiting right now for our Gravity pilots that you can see on the bottom line. So Lots of work across the 3 Gravity work streams and lots of work that's not even represented here, and very grateful for the collective that makes it all go. Is historical trauma or stress due to racism going to be part of the stress domain? We will talk about that today. Absolutely, that's on our stress kickoff, considering those things. Evelyn saying, stay tuned for more information on the Gravity pilots via our Confluence. All right, next slide, please. This is an overview of the integration of our 2 work streams, terminology and technical. Next slide. Again, these are the use cases you heard me reference with Corey. So these are our core use cases. If you look at the implementation guide, they really break these 3 kind of fundamental use cases out into different types, sub use cases and considerations that are really critical when thinking about interoperability and data sharing. But we started way back in the day with these 3, documenting SDOH data in conjunction with the patient encounter, tracking intervention to completion, and gathering and aggregating for uses beyond the point of care. We still have to revise these based on the conversation we had about 6 weeks ago, and I think we will someday. These are definitely something that we're considering as we take on greater work, especially considering population health. Next slide, please. So again, just a brief restatement of the goal. Our goal is developing consensus-driven data standards to support use and exchange of social determinants of health data within the healthcare sector and between the healthcare sector and other sectors. This is the growing list of domains. This is just kind of making evident some of the things that are on our future roadmap that haven't necessarily made it onto the official roadmap yet, but we will put them there in time. Next slide, please. Any questions on what we've done so far? Again, there's no policy update or technical update, so it's just terminology today. Any other questions? All right.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Sarah. It's Corey. Sorry, I was
Hi,
on
Corey.
mute. Hello. Good afternoon. As it relates to the previous slide and the domains, do we have any sense from the community in terms of the relative priority of which of these should be focused on next? Oh, not the use. I'm sorry. The next slide. The domain slide.
What I'm hoping to do, actually, in the I would say April and June, is use part of the summer to help us make that discernment and make that choice, because we've been operating basically, from the Academy's paper, like anything that was in the Academy's paper, we've been put on our roadmap, but I think we can be a little bit more intentional about it. So I hope to do a community survey of sorts from many different stakeholder perspectives over the course of the late spring and summer to shape that work.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, so Jen is asking, what about disability? So what we'll do, what we try to put is these things in what we call the parking lot. The parking lot gets kind of large, but the parking lot's not a place of being forgotten. Because if you'll see a lot, we've talked about this often in the Gravity Project, is there's an interconnectivity to many of the domains and how they affect individuals and how we address them. So part of the parking lot is to create like circles of things, because you can see what we've placed on the roadmap next already are things of the communities we live within, like community considerations of things that came up when we were addressing earlier domains. Like, for example, we talked about food insecurity way early in our project, but recognized that we had yet to talk about community food security or food access issues, right? So we knew we had to talk about that then. It was different, so we put it out into space. And the same thing goes with neighborhood environments and neighborhood safety, right? It would be appropriate to consider other things that are akin to it and like it, and group them together. So that's one of the considerations we'll think about. So we've also talked about environment. You can see that on the slide too. So like issues of environmental racism and environmental influences on health, those might be appropriate for that neighborhood linking. So disability is something we've mentioned before across many different perspectives, and it's on there, and we don't necessarily have a place for it yet, but it's in the works. That was a longer answer probably than you intended. But again, this is about the logic of things being interrelated. Like right now, we're doing interpersonal domains, like domains of myself and other people, like isolation, intimate partner violence, elder abuse, etc. Next slide, please. I think,
Sarah?
yeah, hi, yes?
Yeah, I just want to mention that I've just come across a paper from England published probably a little over a year ago, the title of which is Power, Control, Communities, and Health Inequalities, Theories, Concepts, and Analytical Frameworks. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that all of our subject domains could be sorted into the two buckets that they suggest helps people to think about empowering communities to improve their health: the emancipatory power framework and the limiting power framework. So I'm going to put this in the chat, and I encourage anybody interested in connecting the dots between how we talk about things and whether we can actually change things. I would encourage to take a look at this paper. It's quite provocative, and it's actually based on a research project that was funded. I haven't read the whole thing. There are 3 long papers to read, but it's actually based on a research project in the UK intended to encourage interventions to improve social determinants.
That sounds lovely, Lucy. So those themes are very similar to the paper, the World Health Organization Conceptual Framework for Action on the Social Determinants of Health, that I think I put in the link last time, which we should just add to our resources page. It'd be great to get a reference library. So maybe what we'll try to do is take some of the things that we do have references within each of our domains, but maybe what we'll try to do on the Confluence is have a meta reference area. Well, maybe we already do, and I just haven't found it. But Lucy, I'm committed to making that so.
Great.
We all love getting homework.
You don't have enough to do, so this will be something else that you get to do.
Yeah, and Greg said he loves getting homework assignments from Lucy, and he's not alone. Yes, legal barriers at some point. Absolutely, Tim Johnstone. Yes, we've talked about this as well. So we definitely have legal barriers, and it makes me think about, yes, it makes me think about all kinds of internet connectivity regarding things, immigration status, public charge, etc. Siren does have a great reference library. Can we add to that? We can add to that, and we can link to it too. Siren has like the best reference library. Okay, so Tim Johnstone, we definitely had legal barriers on our radar already. And then I think Lucy's working to get the link in there, Carrie. All right, okay, there it is. Okay, lovely, thank you, Lucy. All right, next slide. This is on to terminology, next slide. So here we are kicking off stress and talking about material hardship. We had a new member that I was talking with today who joined a couple meetings ago. And if you joined a couple meetings ago for the first time, you entered the highway going like 85 miles an hour because it was the wrap up of domains we talked about for like 4 to 6 months. So hopefully this is a more gentle entree for people who are just coming back, coming to us as we kind of kick off a couple different domains in kind. Yes, so Mike is saying there's a body of work in primary care on harnessing ICF. We might be able to link to that work when the time comes. Yes, I have talked to a few of the disability advocates in the country regarding this approach. I think we'll have Mike. I'll definitely try to reference that work when we consider it. We definitely need to do an intentional piece of work and trying to figure out the timing for addressing disability insofar as making sure we have the collective that we need to get that work done well. It might not be this fall, it might be this winter, and we just really take a slow approach to it to make sure it's addressed sufficiently. Yes, it is complicated. All right, so we're kicking off stress and wrapping up material hardship. And then over the course of the next months, right, we have social isolation, elder abuse, intimate partner violence to consider. We're hoping to take these in small sections and really resolve some of the concerns with them swiftly so we can have more rapid votes so that folks who are coming new to the call are not accountable to information that was presented many, many weeks ago. So we have another 3 months of work ahead of us and hoping to kind of nail down some of the complexities of the domains quite swiftly, again, focusing just on screening questions and answers to diagnoses and hoping to get things tidily set. Next slide, please. This is our process, pre-work identification, brainstorming, reviewing it together, voting on the sets, analyzing gaps, building anything that is a gap into code, and then testing and evaluating. I'm really, really excited to finally get the testing and evaluating on the roadmap with the piloting. I do want to give a special shout out to the communities that are already actively testing and evaluating, communities such as Carrie Nicholas in Washington, visionary work going on there, and our colleagues at DC CRISP. We have lots of friends across the country who are already trying to put some of the things we're talking about into work. And we're very, very grateful because that's instant feedback that we need to make sure that we get things done right. Next slide, please. Just stating what the identify process is. So the identify stage is defined by collaborative engagement to ensure we define what data is required and how to place it within the logical constraints of the evidence and the taxonomy. So we have these constraints. One is the evidence of the domain itself, evidence of its measurement, evidence of its health risks, and then the taxonomies and terminologies. I call it ordering the sea, which is a little overwhelming. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to take us back really quickly through some financial insecurity material hardship differentiation. So again, we talked about financial insecurity. Material hardship is the lack of a specific socially perceived basic physical necessity. And you'll see why I'm reminding you of that based on what comes in the next couple slides. So next slide, please. This is an incomplete list. This is just to get a reference, and you'll see why. So the financial insecurity and material hardship sometimes overlap, and sometimes they don't. Material hardship can be independent of financial insecurity. Next slide, please. You'll remember this from the last presentation as well. I think I presented on this about a month ago now. So this was the spectrum of financial insecurity and material hardship insofar as it aligned with domains we've covered so far. So food insecurity definitely has a spectrum that covers material hardship at its most severe. Housing instability and homelessness have the same. Transportation insecurity has the same. But then there are experience of each of these things that are similar that are just because the thing is not there. So I have food insecurity related to a famine or disaster. We think about the sequelae of some of the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. Transportation insecurity and issues of rural access, digital inequity, like lack of broadband in rural areas, or simply not having internet because you're homeless and your child can't access virtual education, which is especially a problem right now, or lack of childcare resources. So there's the financial drivers, and then there's just the thing is not there and I can't get it. Next slide, please. And I just want to orient. Transportation access is not tied to being rural. Janice, can you let us know what you mean? There definitely are rural implications for transportation insecurity. That's what I was trying to mention. If you want to type more into the chat, also you can just let us know. So the element of transportation insecurity I was talking about was when, and transportation access was when you do not have robust transportation options because you live in a rural environment and you can't access, there is no public transport, there is no ability to walk to the store, etc. Please feel free to put in the chat if you have further comments there. We covered this in our transportation insecurity build, which we just wrapped up, and we're happy to hear your thoughts. So just again covering material hardship screening tools and subdomains. So Important to note that sometimes when we're screening for material hardship, we know the driver, like we know whether it's financial or whether it's not, and then sometimes we don't. So Prepare, one of our core tools that we use in the social risk screening ecosystem, assesses whether you're unable to get something. But it doesn't necessarily ask if it's because of financial limitations or because it just doesn't exist. Whereas there also are tools that assess whether your utilities are shut off or you're having trouble paying for gas, electricity, that relate material hardship to a financial driver. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we wanted to present and get in front of you is what happens when you try to take these concepts out into diagnoses. We talked about this in theory about a month ago, but if you were to carry out the concepts of material hardship, which does not have a specific origin, and material hardship, which is linked to limited financial resources, to its natural extension, you would have something that looks like this. So you would have unable to get to obtain adequate clothing and unable to obtain adequate clothing because of limited financial resources. Unable to obtain adequate utilities, unable to obtain adequate, utilities because of limited financial resources, and et cetera. And I'm going to pause now because you all can look at that. I'm going to try to answer some of the questions. So I see Janice and Karen. Janice, public transportation can be a major transportation insecurity issue because it significantly limits where you can go. Yeah, so Janice, I actually think that we're agreeing, so maybe I misunderstood the first statement. We did talk extensively regarding this, regarding our transportation insecurity build. We actually were lucky to have Alexandra King as part of that work, who is a community transportation Association of America expert in rural transportation insecurities. So we did try to include those concepts in our transportation build. So if you would like to review, we do have the transportation data set on the Confluence for review. So, and Monique is asking if food insecurity is a material hardship. So food insecurity, severe food insecurity would be the absence of a specific social necessity. So that would be a material hardship. However, what we're trying to address here are specifically material hardships that are not covered in any of our other domains. So, and then Cynthia's asking, is material hardship related only to limited financial resources? And the answer is no. So as I was trying to make clear, but probably didn't do a very good job, it is really important to state that material hardship is sometimes related to not being able to afford things and sometimes related to just not being there. And the statement I have in the bottom is me trying to organize this for everybody. And again, we'll see what everyone thinks, right? So one of the things we sort in Gravity in our work in terminology is what is the primary experience of the thing. So although each of these limited financial resources, material hardship concepts are related to financial insecurity, the primary experience and the thing that we're intervening on a clinical perspective or a social perspective or a community-based organization perspective is the absence of the thing, right? So it might be able to resolve by giving money, but more often than not is connecting to utility assistance or trying to do like pharmacy prescription assistance, specifically intervening in the lack of the necessary thing. So this was the driver behind our subject matter experts differentiating food insecurity from financial insecurity from material hardship, was when it gets to this state, you're specifically trying to address the necessity, and that is the primary objective.
Sarah?
Yes?
I wonder if clothing really belongs here. I've been thinking about material hardship, first of all, as unrelated to financial distress, because it involves lack of a community resource. And when you read that paper I just referred to, you'll identify immediately what I'm thinking about. If you can't get broadband, no amount of money is going to enable you to get that if you choose to stay where you're living, and there isn't any.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see clothing, or maybe you could explain why you think clothing is in that comes within this domain. And while you're thinking of that, I was wondering whether something about culturally appropriate, like you might have the financial resources to buy the food you need, but you can't get the food you want, the food of your homeland or the food that you would like to become acquainted with, because 7-Eleven doesn't stock it. And that's where you usually go. So I'm wondering if culturally appropriate food sources would come under the idea of material hardship, because you're just not eating enough or eating right because you can't get the right kind of food. And that has nothing to do with the money that you have to spend on it.
Okay, so that, Lucy, that was a lot. I'm going to try to do my best to answer those things. So starting from the back, cultural limitations on food intake are part of food insecurity. It's part of the definition.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I'm gonna, yeah, and then I think you're right. So the reason why these concepts are here, the basic framing is that if you don't have a thing you need, it is its own concept within the social risk world, which is a material hardship. So unable to obtain adequate clothing, even though it's unlikely that you would have it, not have that because it's not available in the community. This is just a mirror for the other material hardships, which have these balance between it doesn't exist and it doesn't, and I can't afford it, right? So it's hard to imagine a use case for that first concept, but it mirrors the other framing. And then I want to try to get through, there's a lot of comments here. So I answered the material hardship related to only limited financial resources. The answer is no, right? Because you can have an absence of something simply because it doesn't exist in the environment or the community. And then, oh my Lord, there's so many comments. It's hard. Every time someone says something new, it pops up. Joni's saying, so if you can't get internet because you can't afford it, that's financial insecurity. And if you can't get it because it isn't available, that's material hardship. And according to the way the subject matter experts are framing this, no. So if you can't get it, if you don't have it, and it's not specified in another domain, that's material hardship. If it doesn't exist for you, it's a material hardship. And then if you can't get it because it doesn't matter if it's from financial perspectives or whether it's from other perspectives, like whether it doesn't exist in the community. So that's the basic, the bottom line. If it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. And then and so Janice, I think you and I should probably talk offline so I can fully understand your question regarding transportation security, because I would love to try to address it within the context of the things we've discussed on previous calls. And then, oh my Lord, every time someone, then Thomas adding, I suggest adding unable to obtain household goods. We talked about that last time, and Carrie's echoing that. And then Mike's asking, Sarah, can you walk us through an example? This can be difficult. Utilities are a great example of, as in Michigan, our CBOs really wanted a specific domain for utility assistance because of organized programs to support this. So we actually entertaining a digital inequity domain, but part of the problem with the things that are covered here in the material hardship is not every single one of these things is a domain under its own right, but each of them are really critically important. So an example that might be, if we want to think of an example of the differentiation between these two things. So if I live in the small city of St. Albans that I take care of in Vermont, I might not be able to afford internet, but it's available as broadband in my community. If I live in the mountains outside of St. Albans, it doesn't exist at all. So there is no broadband capacity, so I just simply don't have it. Or an example might be like if you, don't have, if you can't afford childcare, for example, versus there are no childcare facilities in your region that have openings. Mike, is that a sufficient carrying of the examples that you were asking for? And then Doug is saying inability to get health care because the community does not have it. We were actually talking about healthcare access in the past. That is kind of in a park because we're trying to figure out where that goes, whether it is part of our environmental domains that we're covering in the fall, or whether we should cover it as a material hardship. Doug, that's 100% on the radar. We don't know where to sort it yet. And Doug, it is very reasonable. We were talking about this at great length a couple meetings ago. And then Tom is saying clothing referrals are a common request to 211 for school, job, interviews, and work. And Hasna actually had a lovely example of clothing, lovely story regarding clothing a little bit ago. She's always very good. And then, yes, Lucy, there's a lot of potential overlaps and multiple possible ways to interpret and code a problem. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to state regarding this is we don't necessarily need to seek any further clarity than we have in the clinical community. I was thinking about the intersection of so many of the different clinical conditions that my patients have and how they influence each other, and how they overlap with each other. So the idea is to create something that's intelligible to the user and intelligible to the person and intelligible to the ecosystem. And it might overlap with other domains and other areas, but really us understanding what we mean when we say a thing is the most important thing. Whew. So I'm trying to understand, so what is there clarification, Ari, what is included with utilities? We were defining utilities as according to HUD, which is electricity, etc. Electricity, gas. We can expand it if needed into sub-utilities, but we were using the HUD definition of utilities. Jillian's saying one of the issues that makes it difficult for us to use LOINC items that many of the items use complex language that isn't accessible. This is Jillian Kerr. Oh, wow. So Jillian, this is actually a really interesting concept, which I'm trying to figure out how to place in here regarding, so we're talking about diagnoses now, so it's not necessarily as linked to the LOINC question. We were talking about standardization and standardized tools and translating them in multiple languages at a previous call, and that's a really important concern. We've also talked about language and the barriers of language as a domain of its own as well. Carrie's asking, can we add appropriate to clothing? It's very weather specific. I'm going to put a note on that. Oh my Lord. Adequate to me works as well as appropriate. Would the unable to obtain adequate clothing as a material hardship cover clothing items for religious purposes, not having access to hijab or kippah? I'd imagine it would. Okay. So Mike, can you unmute yourself and talk a little bit so that I can understand what you're mentioning there?
Couple things. Yeah, this is,
okay.
Hi everybody. There are two things that I'm thinking about as I'm listening to this, and I'm seeing how material hardship seems like some other domains to be maybe hierarchical, in that there are some things that are core concepts that we're trying to discriminate between for purposes of knowing where to put them in a structure. Limited financial resources versus an implication of that. And you're absolutely right, and I salute trying to be practical here, so we don't have to figure out everything, and everything does not have a really clear cleave point. But I was just starting to write it in the text. This is going to be a problem with data retrieval if we have groups that are taking different routes to get to the same problem and putting it in different terms because it's sort of okay. If you're trying to figure out utility assistance, for example, I'll pick on that example again. Utility assistance might be seen as a material hardship, or it might be seen as a housing thing, or it might be seen as something else. And as we're instructing new groups to begin to use these terms, if there's ambiguity in how you map to them, then there will be ambiguity that may really have meaning when you're trying to retrieve them. And I just want us to be careful about this. Material hardship is going to be a good one to parse this out because of everything you just said. It's primary experience, versus something that might be considered causality. And, you know, we know this in primary care. You know, do you manifest the symptom or do you put what diagnosis it might be at some point? And that leads to an awful lot of noise in medical data as well.
So can you help me understand, we have yet to cover any of these concepts in other areas of our terminology work. So help me understand what your thoughts are for resolving some of the complexity here.
Well, in these 5 examples, you may be right in that we haven't covered them elsewhere, but in some places that have worked in this space, utilities have been addressed in different ways. I'll select that example. Unable to obtain medicine, like we just sort of almost broached into that conversation here, is unable to obtain healthcare. And that will probably show up in other places as well. And it was wise that we parked it. I'm just thinking that we could make a list of maybe 20 things that we can't obtain or someone can't obtain because of limited financial resources, that as we're trying to explain this concept, we have to then give those that are trying to use what we're designing an understanding of why we chose these and not others that seem very similar. I think that's why all the questions are coming in the chat. We're all trying to just grapple with, where do we leave this off? How far does this go when it's cross-cutting? And I think, like everybody else on the call that's kind of hearing this for the first time, I'm trying to figure out in my own head how to parse that so I can explain it to others.
I think maybe it'd be helpful to go back, and I agree. This is so tricky, we pulled it out and made its own domain, right? So if we can go back to the screening questions and answers for a second, the previous slide, right? So these are the approaches we're dealing with, right? So these are the approaches that are already in the ecosystem that create outcomes that we need, that are critical, that we need to define, right? So prepare is fundamentally a question of material security. Do you have the thing, right? And it is not a question that defines whether it was because you couldn't afford it or whether it was because it simply doesn't exist, right? So both of those outcomes are possible, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
But what you have after somebody has completed the prepare, if they check food, clothing, medicine, it requires some clarification as to why or how those are identified by the person that may lead you into material hardship, or it may lead you into something else.
Yes.
And that's where the implementations are going to get a little tricky.
100%. So then if we go back to the proposals, right? And again, it's challenging. So if we go back to the proposed outcomes, they directly map the first level to concepts in the I don't have it, with no specification, right? I don't have it because I don't have it, right? And then the second, for instance, like health leads questions or other questions in the ecosystem would map to I don't have it because I can't afford it, right? And when we've thought about creating just the kind of parent concept of I don't have it, it was deemed not sufficient for interventions because it's a very different thing to intervene because you can't afford it than intervening because it is not there.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And the work will come when we are trying to sort potential diagnostic codes for this in the diagnosis part of the gravity care wheel, I think. As a screening question, I think we're on pretty okay grounds, but in the specific problems linked to interventions part, that's where it's going to get tricky. At least that's what I'm seeing now in front of me.
Oh, it is going to get tricky. So this was what we need to consider, right, is this approach to assessing things and intervening directly on the absence of necessities is out there, right? and I guess I wonder, it's like, do we have, so this is the idea, right? And do we have other thoughts about how to better organize it or better parse it out? Or should we think on it?
Thinking on, I'm also looking at the chat here, and I see Tom Page put down something that would be maybe worth considering is, does it help to parse these issues by looking at material hardship as relating to tangible things instead of services?
So building material hardships focusing just on the absence of things, right?
And yeah, and I don't know if Tom is on, can unmute himself and explain it better, but that's one organizing principle here. And Sarah, you and the team have thought about this far more than probably any of us individually, so we can
No, but I
follow
love
your
that
lead on this.
idea.
Yeah.
We have to create things that make sense, and this is why we come together, right? So we know we need to create language for this, but let's make it as good as we can. So Tom, can you unmute yourself and help us walk through walk through your thoughts there? It looks like Corey has a little bit of thoughts as well.
Yeah, sure. I think it comes down to helping us all define what we really mean by material hardship. Certainly it can be related to a lack of financial resources or a lack of access, but are we talking about lack of access or about material hardship as not having things people need to live a safe and healthy life? And it gets a little fuzzy when we get to things like the utility systems or internet, possibly childcare, but it seems really definitive that not having clothing, not having a bed, not having cooking utensils, or maybe medicine fall very clearly into material hardship. I'm just, is there a conversation we can have that would help to define material hardship more effectively to inform our conversation as we move forward?
That's a good question, Tom.
Yeah.
Oh, does somebody want to talk?
Hey, Sarah, this is Charles.
Hi, Charles.
Hi.
Yes.
So
Okay, talk.
if I may suggest, because yeah, I agree that the list could be limitless. So can we maybe use income to represent possible per capita income, or in the community from a population health, but from individual, a certain income could represent the material hardship. Access to care is important. Lack of access to care could be other proxy to represent material hardship. So maybe the income could be a proxy to
Well,
this piece more.
the problem is that these experiences are independent of income. So being unable to afford something is not related to, is associated, but not limited to income. So we would miss a significant swath of the people we're trying to address if we do that. So let me see if I can create some themes that I hear, right? So in the grand scope of ordering the sea, this is a first attempt. It has limitations. It might be good to focus on specifically on hardships that are tangible versus hardships that are services, right? I hear that from Tom. I hear about specifying the difference between when something is not present because it's not in front of you. I hear basically Cynthia talking about material lack and structural elements. We've talked about structural elements a lot. I hear Corey talking about want to consider lumping first and splitting. Another possible approach might be to reduce our scope to that which we know is minimally valuable relative to a specific problem that implementers are ready to use. And I think in that scope, Corey, like the interesting thing is the one that people are hungriest for right now. And again, this is just because of the time, is definitely the utilities and internet one because of the current predicament we are all in, right? So we had talked about where to put digital inequity on the roadmap, and we already had material hardship on our roadmap. And it was thought that that was, specifically when you're unable to obtain it because of limited financial resources versus unable to obtain it because it doesn't exist in the ecosystem. It was hard to not align it with that. Are there things that I'm missing? The enormous scope of defining the details. Yeah. So right now, each of these things is linked to a direct question that's in a standardized screening question and answer set that we ask in the ecosystem. They're not incredibly far afield. And then Tom is echoing. Oh, so, yes?
I'm sorry. Hi, this is Cynthia Cabales. I was going to go back to, you've mentioned internet a couple of times, but I'm kind of wondering if that needs to be broadened to communication more generally. I know that there's been a lot of focus in particular with regards to telehealth and education with regards to lack of internet, but I'm kind of wondering also if more broadly, communication is still a valid dimension to look at. So for example, if you are deaf and you don't have the appropriate kind of phone to help you communicate, or if you're blind, you know, I think there are also certain areas where you may not even have an adequate phone grid. So I'm wondering if like internet needs to be broadened a little bit, or if perhaps communication is a different dimension from internet, perhaps.
Well, we have talked about it. There's themes of access that we've talked about in our work on housing, and we certainly have talked about it in our work regarding literacy. I think we need to build space for that, because one of the things I think, and Corey's really good to remind us of this, is that we don't need to, we need to address critical things, and we can possibly imagine ways to build space for critical conversations that we need to have, because we need to address that. We absolutely ethically need to address the concept you're talking about. I can imagine it being within the disability space, and I can imagine that being here as well. So it's a tricky one.
And I'm just going back to work that I, from when I worked at an FQHC, Healthcare for the Homeless. We had patients or clients who didn't even have cell phones. So without cell phones, if you're on the street, you have no way to connect to healthcare. And I think this is also making me think of another test potentially for these different slices of dimensions might be, and I think there was a speaker earlier who mentioned, how is this actionable then? Like, how does this map from a data perspective to a possible intervention? Does that make sense?
Can you repeat that statement? Can you repeat that statement for me just so I can understand?
Sure. I'm thinking, if you think about, somebody said earlier, from a data perspective, one of the values of this is looking at how you can connect this to a potential solution or resolution, or some kind of action that's actionable. And I think an example I have from working at an FQHC with a homeless, you may have somebody where the question is not even a matter of having access to internet. It's just as simple as, do I have access to a phone so that I can connect to healthcare, so I can connect to a provider? And if you were to think about those dimensions, perhaps looking at, once you get the framework set up, and what the test for the framework is. Because if I think about a patient or a client who cannot communicate with a provider, then the solution could potentially be looking for funding to get them a phone, which is different from them looking at funding for internet capability and Wi-Fi access. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And so I think we do always try to hypothesize. So these are the considerations we think of for inclusion. I hope I'm going to be answering Mike's question as well. So We think about the things that we know are linked to health risks and health associations principally, right? The things that we know are affecting the well-being, either the psychological well-being or the physiologic well-being of the people we serve. So it's not just driven by the tool. And of course, certainly we couldn't imagine to be including every single thing. So I wonder if it would be helpful for me to take back some of the comments we've heard today and present, digest this with the material hardship subject matter experts, and then present it back to the community and see if we can get something that's tidy and representative and seems significant, understanding that it might not be the answer to every single thing that individuals are seeking, but it might be able to address some of the core concerns that we know to be present and at hand. Does that seem like a good course of events? A good way to go?
Hey, Sarah, this is Hasna.
Hi, Hasna.
How are you?
Good.
I'd love to talk to you offline about this because
Lovely.
as I'm listening to everyone, it really does fall into three categories. And I'm speaking from, a person who lives here in New York City in terms of access, finances, and communication, right? If you don't know, how do you then access that resource? So, for instance, there are several parents here who do have computers, but they didn't know that they could use the Wi-Fi of the neighboring school. So the signal is very strong, and all they had to do was go across the street and request access, right? They knew that they could get free lunch for themselves and their family, but they didn't know that they could also have access to the Wi-Fi and thus not have to figure out, with the limited finances I have, what do I need to take away to then, purchase Wi-Fi from, Verizon or whatever carrier. And this is, yes. So Marion just said knowledge. Absolutely. That's what I have in my paper. It's, do you even have knowledge that this exists, right? Are you aware that there are, nonprofits that if you call every Thursday and say, hey, I'm a male, I'm size such and such, and they tell you, we have 3 suits that are your size. Please come in with your ID, this, and you can pick them up, right? That's where, I feel like as I'm reading the notes and listening to everyone talk, it's communication, then being able to access it. And, and then if you fall into a financial range where it's not free, can you afford it?
I think that's incredibly helpful framing. I think for the purposes of this domain, I think we need to think about the knowledge base, but that was the guardrails we placed on this domain would be influenced by that, but we didn't actually intend, I think, to cover the knowledge. Like, for instance, Joni's talking about knowledge as a critical facet as well, because we've talked about knowledge and literacy and barriers as a domain unto itself. But what I'm hearing is that we can't address this well without building a kind of a map of how that affects these things. So Hasna, let's meet offline, and so we can try to transfer that into what we see here.
Absolutely.
And I do want to state, so simply saying, so whenever we do this work in Gravity, we kind of create, again, like guardrails for what we're talking about when we material hardship as defined by the academy or defined by the subject matter experts in the literature is literally like this thing doesn't exist for me, and it doesn't include all of those other elements, but we obviously need to address them now. So we will do so. And then.
So Sarah?
Yes.
Can I make a follow-up?
Hi, Julia.
Hey, it's Julia from NAC. So totally agree with a lot of the comments here. I think for me, the thing that most strongly resonated is that communication is almost like a modality. It's not a material hardship separately. It's how we need that information to know how people are able to access services, regardless of what some of those services are. So I would suggest we think about having that as a domain, lack of access to communication, I think internet might be considered a utility. NAC is pushing for internet to become a public utility. So that might be a consideration. It might strengthen that argument actually if we included it in that grouping as a separate subcategory. But I think this goes back to some of my earlier comments about and this, people said, if you don't have a financial ability to access these things versus other reasons you can't access them, like there's no internet in your area versus you can't pay for it, that does lead to different interventions. So I think it's important to be thinking about interventions. I can say that NAC is working with funding from Robert Wood Johnson on some of this interventions work. And of course, we're a core part of the Gravity Project. So I think we should always be considering that. I know that's part of what you've been building out with each domain. But communication, I would suggest that separately because it's almost a matrix kind of thing again, as opposed to physically having the cell phone.
Okay, so Julie, maybe you can help me map out how that relates to the situation. Are we talking about pulling utilities and internet from this material hardship diagnosis and creating a separate domain of work? Is that what I hear you saying?
No, I think that we should leave internet with utilities as a subdomain and leave utilities and material hardship and create a separate domain, which is access to communications or ability to use communications modalities.
Yeah, okay, and that would relate to how we've talked about things in the past, right? So that makes sense to me. And again, so there's lots of comments in here. Okay, so I have a directive to take back and apply some of the things that we've been talking about. I have a conversation with Hasna, and I have a conversation with Julia in my world. And it's true that people might not fess up to illiterate people have strategies. I'm trying to see, so this is talking more about how the intersection of awareness and knowledge influence access, I believe, is what I see in the chat right now. Is that what I see?
Yes.
Yeah. And then certainly, I think attempting to create guardrails for material hardship is not an exclusion of the effect of awareness and knowledge and access. And I'm sorry if it's coming across that way. It's more that the original guardrails were set with the definition of the academy in mind, but we will do our best to integrate the knowledge and access element and return with that and influence what Hasna is saying and what Julia was saying as well. But again, also try to keep our eyes on the prize regarding specific thing that we set out with our subject matter experts to try to address as we go forward.
Sarah, what is a material hardship subject matter expert? Who are what discipline or profession or knowledge base are you referring to when you talk about material hardship subject matter experts?
So the material hardship subject matter experts that we are talking about are the experts in poverty and hardship that we have been working with on the financial insecurity domain for the last few months. Because the outgrowth of, and it's really because that it specifically arose from the unable to obtain adequate clothing because of limited financial resources and the unable to obtain things. And it was their statement that material hardship was a thing separate that we brought back to the community as part of the ICD-10 submission in early December, right? And then, so they are the people we lean on here, really trying to create space for this experience where you're addressing the needs of families that have critical things missing, right?
Okay.
And so families that don't have access to clothing, families that don't have access to critical needs, and concepts that are not currently addressed in other domains we covered, and we don't necessarily imagine them to be. Like, we don't imagine making a clothing domain, right? We're not going to do, there's not a clothing insecurity domain to shape, but this is a truth, and it's a hardship that affects our patients. our people and our community members, and trying to make sure it has space. And it's something that's certainly critical from an ethical perspective. So that was the origin, right?
Thank you.
And Sarah, I wonder if you could create like a piece of metadata that describes, the nature of the hardship, right? So you might not have access to a cell phone because you can't afford one, but you also might not have access to a cell phone because you're in a domestic violence situation where your partner won't let you have access to that.
Mm-hmm.
So it may be very helpful in selecting the right intervention to understand the nature of the challenge.
Yeah.
And I think some of those challenges would be universal across all of the subdomains within material hardship, and therefore creating a single categorization where you could have a pick menu and then apply those would maybe be a preferred approach to kind of post-coordinate it than to pre-coordinate like 1,000 subcodes under each category.
Yeah, so we had initially proposed just the unable to obtain concepts. And then earlier on, a while ago, we're asked to parse it out to the limited financial resources as kind of the most common driver for the absence. And that's what we're presenting here, right? But I hear you. Okay, so it's 5:15. We haven't even kicked off stress yet. So it's very clear that this is complicated, right? And it's very clear that addressing this concept creates a whole host of questions regarding practicality, regarding the capacity to intervene, regarding what is necessary, regarding differentiating between what Hasna was talking about, these kinds of, the different drivers, creating space for knowledge as a barrier, and having to give that credence, whether it be from Joni's comments regarding how perhaps an elder person's inability of knowing how to navigate the internet affects internet access, to all the different things we've seen in the chat. So there's a lot to unpack here. And of course, I'm just also thinking about what is practical. So Corey's asking, Julia's question gets to another use case. Do we have to deliver a coding solution that captures a diagnosis as a single code? Or can we capture multiple codes that when combined according to some kind of grammar express the desired meaning? I have a hard time knowing how that would work as a clinician. So literacy is also a spectrum. Yes, so we clearly need to get our eyes on the literacy and knowledge work. Because so many of the things we've talked about today require that work to be done well, and I'm really looking forward to talking to Hasna about that. And then, okay, Sassy, sorry. I did start the meeting with the forbidden phrase that I think this would be a short meeting today. I know I did that. Okay, so I will do my best to encapsulate everything we've talked about so far. And then, okay. So many things to parse out in the chat. I did not do a very good job of bringing everything in today. Okay. Let's try to touch on stress very briefly. And just so you know, I personally now am not stressed, even though it might seem like I am. I just want to try to get this done. I want to try to be responsive to everything you're talking about while keeping eyes on the prize. And then I didn't. So Corey, I hope I addressed your question regarding the grammar bit.
Yeah, it's just it gets back just to use case there. I think all of these questions point out, the scope of all of this work is enormous, and it's all work we probably should do. It's a question of what do we deliver first, and what are the guardrails for what that solution. What are the characteristics of that solution that we need to deliver? And
I know, and it's interesting because you hear this tension, because there's the one tension of keeping things super simple and not pre-coordinating, right? But then that creates a need to that creates perhaps lack of clarity in linking it to interventions, right? Because the interventions in this space are very different. intervening because the thing does not exist, and intervening because I do not have the financial resources, and intervening, as we've heard, because I need to enhance my knowledge regarding the gap. Those are all very different things. So, okay. All right, we're going to try to do quickly. We're going to quickly go into stress. All right. Okay, next slide, please. So Matthew's talking about from the perspective of the clinician. Yeah, so that initial highest level concept was what we were initially presenting. And I'm just going to take what we've said, parse it into a few different versions of it, talk to people who are offering to help on the call. And if you want to send me an email and say, Sarah, I'm happy to help you, that's great. I also have to take this back to the subject matter experts, but really those subject matter experts just want to make sure the thing exists, right? They're the experts of being in front of patients who do not have the thing that they need, and they want to help them. So however we're able to make that go is perfect on their eyes, knowing what they're going to say. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so briefly touching upon stress. Again, we're not covering any real codes right here, but so there's a couple different themes you're going to notice as we talk about stress over the next chunk of time of the next months. So I link a really important paper to ground our work here, stress and health disparities, context mechanisms and interventions among racial, ethnic minority, and low socioeconomic status populations. If you have desire to read a really important grounding paper, that's great. One of our subject matter experts is a key author in that report. So there's a couple of definitions that I want to place here, and I'm always going to try to keep minority stress on the horizon as we're talking about stress. And Carrie, this is in reference to what you were talking about before, earlier on in the call. So stress occurs when individuals experience demands or threats without sufficient resources to meet these demands or mitigate the threats. You can see this definitions from 1984, and there's some language in there that I balk at. But it is a working definition from the APA. So, which is the American Psychological Association. So minority stress is the relationship between minority and dominant values and resultant conflict with the social environment experienced by minority group members. And this is across the minority ecosystem, whether it be LGBTQIA individuals, whether it be racial or ethnic minorities, it doesn't matter. So we keep this in mind only because as we consider stress, we want to make sure that we're encompassing definitions of stress in our work, especially as we work from a social justice perspective. Next slide, please. Again, as a kickoff, it's just important to create a grounding approach, right? So in the stress literature, they kind of divide things up into exposures and responses. So if we all remember, our charter is for this work is to consider screening questions and answers and diagnoses. The reassuring thing based on the conversation we just had is many of the diagnoses are already set. So because it's a core part of social work and psychologic practice and psychiatric practice, many of these concepts are already in the ecosystem. We may not have to build new diagnostic code. But we need to consider the different aspects of it with our subject matter experts and as we go forward. So again, the way the stress literature is organized in exposures, so the things that we're exposed to and the responses we have. And the responses are either like psychological, which is, there's the statement, I feel stressed, or physiological, right? So exposures run across the spectrum. This is by all means not comprehensive. It's just a representative statement. So we have stigma and bias, and I reference again minority stress. We have financial strain. We have transitions, like big changes. Nursing has a lovely theory regarding transitions, that all transitions affect the person as a stressor, even if it's a good transition. Caregiving role strain, whether it be for someone in your family as a child or someone in your family as an elder. Relationships can cause stress, and their absence can cause stress. Trauma obviously causes stress, and we were talking about that earlier in our work regarding chronic stress exposures, history of trauma. We are very careful at this time. We are not addressing adverse childhood experiences. Right now, we do have it on our roadmap. Again, we're gathering the work, the people we need to do that well in future work. And then the environment. I did not put work here, even though I should have, really. So many of the screeners that we're talking about really just query for that psychological response, which is the person stating they feel stressed, right? There are all kinds of physiologic tests in the environment. We are not talking about those at this time. So yes, so certainly the health challenges can be part of exposures, and then yeah, so Tom is saying, recently I've been included in some very insightful and enlightening conversations regarding the stigma and bias experienced by neuroatypical people. Yes, sure. So yes, 100%. That could easily be imagined as a minority stress. Oh yeah, so no, so the only reason why that's in parentheses is because I had just, oh, so first of all, where did that comment go? Oh my gosh, there's so many comments that just blipped in there. So C. Fragrance is saying, so stigma and bias are across the spectrum, and the only reason why minority stress is in parentheses is because of the definition before. So certainly stigma and bias apply to individuals who have any kind of stigma and bias, and that is a stress response, creates a stress response. I didn't mean to exclude it. It was more the parenthetical referencing what I'd said earlier. That's where that belongs. Okay, that looks like we're going back to something in financial strain. And then, so Monique is asking,
Sarah?
oh yes, hi Lucy, yeah.
I don't really see where racism fits here. Isn't racism another bullet point? I mean,
Racism
stigma and bias, minority stress, there are 88 variables to define minority groups or self-perceived status as a minority person. It seems to me that racism, as it has become central to certainly political discourse in the country now, merits its own bullet.
It is its own domain, but we could not talk about stress without talking about minority stress, which is different than racism as a concept.
So racism,
because minority stress includes
racism, you're going to treat racism as a domain? Is that what you just said?
Yes, it is 100% on our roadmap. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yes.
So the use of the word minority here does not mean racial minority. It can apply to other minorities too, right? Including sexual orientation, gender identity minorities.
Yeah. In fact, the model I have right here is from Juster et al., which is about LGBTQIA minority stress exposures.
Oh, sorry. I see the small print.
No, it was very way to lead it in. It was perfect. So stigma and bias is inclusive of all stigma and bias. Minority stress is a pan experience across all minorities. Again, we don't have to go back to the definition, but again, it's important to consider, and it's not limited to racial or ethnic minorities. And again, the exposures list was not meant to be comprehensive. It was just, and I obviously missed a lot of things. It was more to set the relationship between exposures and responses. Okay, so now quickly we have, oh my God, my mind is humming today from all the different things we talked about. So next slide, please. Monique is asking where stress due to homelessness or food insecurity fit in. So worrying about not having enough food is indeed a food insecurity concept. Worry and stress are not the same thing. So Monique, it's a hard concept to answer, right? So
Yes, but I would think if I have severe food insecurity, if I don't have food for my children, you can't say I'm not experiencing stress. And I don't, you know, it's very hard for me to understand where these separations lie, but I'm not saying we need the answer now. I'm just trying to consider, you know, I can't imagine that that isn't a kind of stress, even though it's also a kind of food insecurity.
Well, I think the thing is, and this actually references what I was saying earlier, all of these things can be co-experienced, right? So humans are complex people, or they could not be, right? We were actually just talking about this with the stress experts last night. You know, in New England, I've met many of people who are food insecure but do not report stress because they have it dialed down, right? They don't worry, they manage their money, they never run out, they have exactly 4 oranges a month, right? So do they say, I feel stressed as a stress response, right? Do they report like psychological stress? I have not queried for them for that, but they are negative for worry about not having enough food, right? So we could imagine each of these. I don't know if we'll ever be able to say this one stops here and this one starts here, because we're dealing with people who have all of these things co-experiencing at once, or they at least can, right? So I don't even know if that's our intent, to say this is where food insecurity stops and where stress starts. And the tricky thing about stress, and I think it's really, you know, when I was talking about this with this sorry, we're going over time, is that stress is a weird one to have on the roadmap. It is in the Academy's approach because there's almost always a driver, right? And if I'm intervening in something and I'm thinking about Mike and Tom and Corey and Julia, I want to know what's causing you stress, right? So that's usually my next stop, right? So it's tricky, but again, so these things can all coexist, but they don't necessarily have to coexist unless, and they're there by like definition. Like financial strain as a concept is really closely aligned to financial stress, for example. There are overlapping circles between everything. Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that, you know, I could also cite, you know, an anecdotal case of somebody who's under financial strain, but it doesn't cause them stress because somehow they've learned to cope with it. But I think it's it's going to be a hard definition again to say these things fall in stress, you know, and these things don't, or how we're going to, you know, define. I don't know that we need a high level term like stress. I mean, maybe we can just define a set of terms under it, but otherwise it's hard to have that high level thing that groups this and not that simply because that's covered somewhere else. So it comes back to sort of the hierarchies and you know, how we're going to get these high level terms into a terminology without really an unambiguous meaning for them. So it'll be a challenge.
I think, but these ones are already in terminologies as they stand now. I mean, this is like one thing I think that's interesting. So let's just try it. And for those of you who have, I agree, right? The exclusion, saying it's this and not that, is very, very challenging. But these are the kinds of questions that are asked within stress scales, right? And then if you go to the next slide, please. These are more the questions regarding stress. So stress is when someone feels tense, nervous, or anxious, or can't sleep. How stressed are you? And then there's the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health Occupational Stress Questionnaire. So these are all questions, again, in the ecosystem. And then I felt like it was important to show you what diagnostic concepts are already out there. So next slide, please. So this is what's out there already, right? So this is from the compendium that I worked on with UCSF Siren in 2017. So there is already a stress concept, right? There are a host of ICD-10 CM concepts that talk about stress. There's caregiver role strain, decreased stress, emotional stress, physical stress, stress overload, stress at work, work worries, stress-related problems, right? So in this instance, it's not our job as much to make new things. It's our job to work with the subject matter experts to create logical relationships between the screening questions and answers that are out there and the outcomes we're able to have within diagnostic codes. So I don't know if this is more frightening or less frightening, but these are the things that are already there, right? So it's going to be an interesting stress work as we go forward. Any questions regarding this and what we've talked about with stress before we've officially adjourn?
This is on the Confluence website for us to study, right?
It will be.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Gotta go.
I feel obliged if stress is managed poorly in the HX 20. And I feel obliged to say that I did not pick this concept. The Academy did. So we have, darn it, the National Academy of Medicine. Any other concepts before we go? All right. Thank you for your patience and time. Again, we're reviewing material hardship and stress and then coming back in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Sarah.
And I have lots
Bye-bye.
of conversations ahead of me.
Hey, Sarah.
Yeah?
Hi, good job. Thank you. I hope you're not stressed.
Thank you, Charles. And I have an email response to you, friend.
Okay,
Yeah.
I wanted to, does that make sense? Initial, like first impression?
It really does. But there's
Okay.
already existing code in SNOMED that we have to rectify some of those concepts with.
Okay, great. I'm looking forward to your
Hence me sitting on it for a little bit.
Yeah, of course.
Any other questions?
Hey, Sarah.
This was really interesting again.
Oh, thank you. Who was that? Oh, it was Joni. Hi, Joni. Anybody else?
Hi, Sarah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Who is this? Hello.
Hi, this is Corey Spears. It's my first gravity meeting.
Oh, welcome, Corey. Where are you from?
Writer. I just joined
wonderful.
the Casio project just this week, and I heard there may have been crossover in communication previously, and there was interest in rebuilding that. So there's materials I can use to orient myself to this project, and if maybe if there have been previous conversations of alignment between post-acute care and social determinants of health, anything you point me to, or any way we can start up those conversations again, or whatever forum.
That sounds lovely. And I'm sure are you connected to our multiple chronic condition e-care plan work with NIH?
I'm not connected to any of that right now.
Oh, so Corey, we will connect you. We will connect you. Can you drop your, can you send me an email? Here, I'm just going to put my.
Yes, I will.
Okay. Okay, there we go. I'm in the chat.
Thank you.
I love this. Anybody else need?
Sarah, this is Tom Page. You did a terrific job facilitating today. These are really tough and complex issues.
Oh my gosh, I know. Luckily, I have you out there, my fellow clinician. Yeah.
Well, I come from a 211 information and referral background.
Oh, well then I thought you were a clinician because there you go. Okay.
I work really closely though with Mike Klinkman.
Oh, that's right, Tom. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
And actually, I'm in a well, could we have an offline conversation, because the company I work for has developed some really comprehensive social determinant screening and assessment tools, but there's some concern about sharing the IP. But I'd like to figure out some way to help share what we've done to inform the conversation. But let's talk offline. I'll send you my.
Yeah. So Tuesday afternoons, Thursday afternoons, and Fridays. That's my time. I would love that. That sounds great.
Okay, great. I will do that.
Okay.
Hold on.
Hi, Joni.
Oh, no, sorry. I got a call coming in. Sorry. I'll go.
Okay. Anybody else?
Thank you, Sarah. Great job.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay. Bye, friends.
Bye-bye.